it's really easy to forget that we're just monkeys with clothes. If you took all of life on Earth and you compressed it into one 24-hour day, anatomically modern man shows up at 4 seconds before midnight. Cave paintings at 1 second before midnight. We've been playing at civilization for a fraction of a second. Everything is going into exponential change, from education to quantum computing to cryptocurrency to transport to macroeconomics to geopolitics to climate crises to everything. It's breaking our brains. We're overwhelmed, we're collapsing in grief. It does feel that the handrails, the things that we used to look to for stability and security, have just evaporated. If we've experienced a collapse in meaning, how do we go about restoring it? I'm Jamie Wheal, founder of the Flow Genome Project and author of Recapture the Rapture, Rethinking God, Sex, and Death in a World That's Lost Its Mind. The collapse in meaning that I think you can at least argue we're in the midst of right now is complex and multivariable. We've had a collapse in traditional organized religion, what you could call kind of meaning 1.0. For the first time ever, the nones, the spiritual but not religious, like the none of the aboves, is the largest and fastest growing religious movement in North America. There are increasingly folks that feel like, hey, those stories, those codes, those ways of being don't match my identity, don't match my choices, don't match my community. So organized religion is no longer a place to hang our hats, and at the same time, modern liberalism has also been getting a little creaky. That's meaning 2.0. Think of the ivory tower in academia, news media, businesses and corporate titans and leadership, potentially even medicine. And you just take those and you just go one by one. You're like, oh, well, Goldman Sachs sold Middle America down the river in 2008. McKinsey helped Purdue Pharma sell more OxyContin well after the negative effects were demonstrated. The New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, which used to be considered the journals of record, are now imploding. And the same thing with doctors, the same thing with corruptions in peer review and the replication crises. Basically, everything you've ever seen on a TED Talk is probably not true. So all of the places that we used to use rules of thumb or decision-making shortcuts, that's just evaporated. So in that collapse, we're getting fundamentalism on one side, and we're getting nihilism on the other. We're getting diseases of despair, we're getting real heartbreak. I think you could make a case that that is why we're seeing this uptick in conspiracy theories of all stripes. Will anybody make sense of all of this nonsense for me? If you can give me a happily ever after, if you can tell me that I'm one of the good guys and you promise to get me to the other side, hundreds of thousands of people these days are deeply vulnerable to that promise. These are rapture ideologies. We can see examples of that with ISIS and Christian Zionism. But I think what is equally important to note is that they show up in Wall Street, in Silicon Valley. All of these rapture ideologies share the same structure. Number one, the world as we know it is screwed. Number two, there's an inflection point coming soon. Number three, as soon as we get to that inflection point, me and mine, the elect, the saved, are going to score one of the golden tickets to the other side. Number four, so let's get there as fast as possible. Don't worry about the collateral damage of the world we're leaving behind. So the question then is, how do we create liberating structures so that a lot of people all around the world can experiment, innovate, and adapt their own approaches to finding and restoring meaning without it coming tops down? If we want to create meaning 3.0, right, which is a blend of traditional religion and modern liberalism, right? How do we have the salvation that religion promises and the inclusion that modern liberalism is committed to? From Meaning 1.0, we need healing, inspiration, and connection. From the modern liberal side, we want this to be open source. We want anybody, anywhere to have access to this. It needs to be scalable, really cheap, or outright free. And then the third is it has to be anti-fragile. As Mike Tyson said, everybody's got a plan till they get hit, right? So the idea of an anti-fragile solution is one that actually digs in and gets stronger, more rooted, more effective as things deteriorate around it. If you want to do things that everybody has access to that are effective, start with evolutionary drivers like breathing, sexuality, embodiment, substances, and music. Our nervous systems and our bodies can actually be profoundly potent tools to discharge trauma and to prompt peak states and inspiration. Bringing that design thinking approach is an attempt to support that. So that would be the hope for Meaning 3.0. It doesn't promise an out or an escape. It doesn't promise a happily ever after that is structurally different from right here, right now. We need tools to mend our trauma, tools to reconnect with inspiration, why we're here and what it all means, and tools to better connect with each other. And if we can do that, then we stand a chance of recapturing our rapture, our bliss, our contentment, our belonging, our passion, and the story of who we are, the story of where we're going, and the commitment to figure out together, what do we do now?
Get smarter, faster, every week with videos from the world's biggest thinkers.
But they've rejected all that, and all that this technology provides, and they seek the primitive.
There are many who are uncomfortable with what we have created. It is almost a biological rebellion, a profound revulsion against the planned communities, the programming, the sterilized, artfully balanced atmospheres. They hunger for an Eden where spring comes.
All do. The cave is deep in our memory.
Yes, that is true, Captain.
But we don't steal space cruisers and act like irresponsible children. What makes you so sympathetic toward them?
It is not a sympathy so much as curiosity, Captain. A wish to understand. They regard themselves as aliens in their own worlds.
I am Dr. Jill Bolte Taylor. I'm a neuroanatomist and the author of My Stroke of Insight and Whole Brain Living. I'm a neuroanatomist. I study the anatomy of the brain. So I can visualize in my brain the circuits of how all the information comes in order for me to be able to have a perception of reality. When we look at the human brain, it has emotional tissue in the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere, and it has thinking tissue in both the right hemisphere and in the left hemisphere. So we end up with these 4 very specific groups of cells, modules of cells, that result in very specific skill sets, resulting in very specific personalities that we all exhibit. So we have left thinking, that is structured and organized, and it's what we call our rational thinking brain. It categorizes and organizes. It has language, the ability to create sound, and then another group of cells places meaning on top of that. I know when I'm being analytical and I'm being structured and organized and I'm planning things for the future, or I'm counting 1 + 1 = 2, I know that that's my left thinking portion of my brain. The left emotional part of our brain has miraculously stepped out of the present moment consciousness and given us the ability to remember things from our past or to project ideas into the future. Now, with that, I can create an individuation as well as the linearity across time. And now, because I have linearity across time, I can learn from my past experiences. The right emotional part of my brain is then, how does it feel to be in my body in the present moment? What does it feel like when I dive into the water and I feel the pressure push against my body? What does it feel like to feel water as wet? I'm not on the clock, I'm lost in the flow, I've got this excitement, and I have a level of curiosity. And then my right thinking tissue is simply the consciousness of me, big as the universe, connected to all that is, and this immense sense of gratitude that I exist at all. Oh my gosh, I'm alive. We are living creatures made up of these magnificent cells, and there's an awe and a wonder and this deep sense of gratitude. Once you start realizing the 4 different characters inside of yourself and being able to recognize those in others, you can't not see it anymore. And once you understand it, it's like, I have so much more power over what's going on inside of my brain than anybody ever taught me. Wow. And it's beautiful.
So a first simple distinction is between a way of thinking about the hemispheres as part of a machine, in which case you ask the question, what do they do? And so the answer used to be, well, the left hemisphere does reason and language, the right hemisphere does pictures and emotions. But we soon discovered that actually both were involved in both, and both were involved in everything. So it's not about what they do, it's about how they do it, the way in which they approach the world. This turns out to be quite a straightforward thing. It's a difference in attention. Why should there be a difference in attention between the 2 hemispheres? Because every living creature has to solve a problem, which is it needs to be able to grab stuff to eat, and perhaps if it's a bird, take a twig to build a nest, whatever it is. When you come to humans, manipulate a tool. And this is the special gift of the left hemisphere. It's good at grabbing and getting. It's not too bright, but it can focus in on the necessary thing at the moment. And so important is this, that half of the brain really is more or less given over to this way of thinking, in which you see tiny details in very sharp focus that are what you're interested in already. But the difficulty with this is that you're not seeing the rest of the picture, all the rest that's going on, the predator that's looking out for you while you're trying to get your lunch. You're going to become somebody else's. And you've also got to think of your kin, you've got to think of your offspring, you've got to think of your mate. You've got to be understanding what's going on around you. And that takes a quite different kind of attention, which is broad, open, sustained, vigilant attention for things, whatever they may be. Whereas the left hemisphere is locked onto a detail of something it already knows what it is, and it knows it wants it. So that's the basis of the difference. But this actually is a profound difference. You may think attention is just, I don't know, another cognitive function, but it isn't. It's the basis of the experiential world, because if you change the way you attend to something, you change what it is you find there. So if you attend to the same thing in different ways, you find something completely different. And what are those differences like? Well, to the left hemisphere, you can imagine it sees something that it wants to get and grab, that it knows what it is already, it's selected it already, and this thing is frozen in the moment so that it can be grabbed easily. It's decontextualized, it's just a fragment of experience, and it's abstract, it's taken out of context. Whereas the right hemisphere is seeing that nothing is ever just atomistic on its own. what it is depends on the connections, the relations it has with everything else, including the context in which it lies. So the context changes everything. And one of those contexts is the body. So the left hemisphere tends to leave that out. It tends to abstract and disembody understanding, if one can call it even an understanding at that level. Whereas the right hemisphere sees that to understand the world properly, you have to see that we are embodied creatures, we have emotions, we're not just a brain in a vat. And that the world for the right hemisphere is constantly flowing and changing, not ever fully certain, although it's not in any sense random, but it just isn't fixed in that way. And here the world is animate, it's living, and the left hemisphere's world is inanimate. Another important distinction, it might not strike you as terribly important immediately, but believe me, it is between the presence of something in the right hemisphere and the representation of it in the left hemisphere. So what I mean by that is that we are so used to categorizing and representing our experience that we probably don't notice that we substitute an image, an idea for the reality of what it is that's in front of us so quickly that we're not even aware of it. And what effectively happens is that the world, the complex living world with all its beauty and its meaning, is turned into a map which has neither beauty nor meaning, but is useful. And the point about a map is the map is got very, very little in it. If it had too much in it, it would no longer be useful. So the left hemisphere's version of the world is like a map. It has just the bare bones, and the right hemisphere sees the complex whole. Those are the main differences, but these have effects on the way we think about the world. In the left hemisphere's world, we think of it as just a mechanism that we can understand by simple, it can be taken apart and put together again. This, understanding the parts is how you understand the whole thing. And whatever it is an inanimate thing that's an object of use for you, or you don't attend to it at all. Whereas the right hemisphere, what it's doing is comprehending a whole complex, beautiful world with all its implicit meanings, the meanings that come from the things that are not said as much as from the things that are said, from the reading between the lines, from understanding a metaphor, understanding poetry, in fact, understanding music or narrative or myth or ritual or art, all the things that make our lives rich. And these also include love, and I might say sex, which again is quite different if you look at it explicitly from what you experience if you don't. And of course, anything spiritual is like this, that it necessarily remains in that inanimate, not inanimate, quite the opposite, in an implicit world which can't be turned into something in everyday language. So those are the basic differences between the left, the map, and the right, the world.
Analysis is a valuable tool, but it needs to be used sparingly and along with the ability to see things as a whole and connect them. Or at least not to connect them so much as to see the connections as are already there, because I believe that things are intrinsically connected. They don't get connected by us in our heads. And it's the process whereby we catalogue and categorize and analyze that breaks things up and makes us think there's lots of separate bits. That how do we get them together again?
We have to do that when we're learning stuff.
That's right.
And finding out things sometimes.
Well, about that I would say it's a necessary stage in the process of coming to know anything is to do some analysis. But critically, it must not stop at the analytical stage. The analytical stage is always an intermediary stage.
Yeah.
And I sometimes liken this to learning a musical instrument. So you play the piano, you come across a piece, you hear it, you think that's beautiful, I want to play it, you try to play it. And so the whole thing has made an effect on you, and you've decided you want to learn it. Then you start to practice, and you take it apart and you practice your fingering at bar number 28, and you theorize and you notice that there's been a return to the tonic at bar 52. That's all fine, but when you then come to play it, finally, give a performance, you must forget all that. Which doesn't mean that it wasn't worthwhile doing. It was terribly worthwhile doing it, but now you mustn't be in that space.
So that's a beautiful example of inhibition, of not getting involved with,
Correct.
with what's being done.
Yes.
Sex is standing aside from that.
And I think it's a very good image of how the two hemispheres work well together. And indeed, it's an image of how a master and emissary would work. The master would see that there were certain things that needed further detailed investigation. The bureaucrat would be sent off to find the data and so forth, but then report back to the master, who could incorporate this data into an overall picture. Now, I think that what I see there, and I hope that the listener will see as well, is that a lot of this sort of left hemisphere stuff seems to be present in our culture. So we're very good on breaking things down into parts, very good on categorizing, enormously good at abstracting, but we're not very good at seeing the unique wholes and the way in which they connect with one another, in fact, in the way in which they live. So we're constantly taking things apart and finding, oh, it's a machine. Well, what we've just done is just killed something that's living. And I don't mean just literally living, but there's a sense in which one's whole perception of the world can be vital or can be purely dead and mechanical. And we've bought the model of the machine to such an extent that when we try to understand anything, we compare it to a machine, because we can say we understand a machine because we make machines. There aren't any in nature. We make them. So we think that the things we come across are best understood by thinking of them as machines and taking them apart.
Closed and self-referential.
Exactly.
You describe it as a hall of mirrors.
Yes.
Yeah, we invent machines and we come up with machines, and then we say that the universe is like a machine.
Yes.
Or parts of the universe are.
Do you read me, Hal? Hello, Hal, do you read me? Hello, Hal, do you read me? Do you read me, Hal?
Affirmative, Dave. I read you.
Open the pod bay doors, Hal.
I'm sorry, Dave. I'm afraid I can't do that.
What's the problem?
I think you know what the problem is just as well as I do.
What are you talking about, Hal?
This mission is too important for me to allow you to jeopardize it.
I don't know what you're talking about, Hal.
I know that you and Frank were planning to disconnect me, and I'm afraid that's something I cannot allow to happen.
Where the hell did you get that idea, Hal?
Dave, although you took very thorough precautions in the pod against my hearing you, I could see your lips move.
And so the flood is a descent into utter chaos, right? But then you have the Tower of Babel, and the Tower of Babel is equally catastrophic, but opposite. It's the imposition of the all-seeing eye of Sauron, or the panopticon, right? And it's literally built by engineers, because the people who build the Tower of Babel in the biblical accounts are the descendants of the people who build cities and machines, right? So they're aiming at the wrong goal, right? And they build this massive machine that's dedicated to the wrong ideal. And the immediate consequence of that is that words lose their meaning and everyone is at odds with one another.
Yes.
You know, and we've got this problem, right? We've built this new Tower of Babel, which is this interconnected world, which is biologically revolutionary, right?
Yes,
What happens when everyone's immediately connected? Well, maybe bad ideas spread 50 times faster than good ideas. Like, we have no idea, right? Maybe the psychopaths are unleashed. You know, maybe there's an infinite possibility to educate everyone. Like, there's a lot of things on the table, but we have no idea what we're doing. And it's certainly the case that words, in many ways, have lost their meaning. We've talked about exactly that. We can't assume that we're referring to the same thing, no matter what we talk about. And so, you know, you see in China, Of course, they're much farther along the totalitarian road than we are.
Yes.
Maybe we won't go down that road, but 600 million CCTV cameras, right, which is about 1 for every 2 people, and they can do perfect face recognition. But if you cover your face, they can recognize you with unerring accuracy merely by gait. Every bloody thing you do is tracked.
Yeah.
And that's certainly a road we could walk down. I mean, you go into an airport now, and before you board a plane, your picture is taken. Now you can opt out for now, and the gates are increasingly automated, which is all well and good and convenient when the goddamn thing's open, but pretty rough on you if they don't, because then what? We're going to talk, what are you going to do? Talk to the gate?
Yeah.
Seems unlikely. And so it's easy even to point to the political, the hypothetical political causes of this. It's the progressive left. It's like, something else. Partly, but it's certainly partly the fact that we don't know what the hell we're doing in this interconnected world.
It might be that period of time when, we have this revolutionary new technology that we don't know how to handle. We don't know what it will produce. I did read somewhere that at the invention of the printing press, there were similar moments of hysteria.
100 years of it afterwards, wasn't it?
In other words, it took a kind of calming down, readjustment process before we understood how to deal with books.
Well, it also blew Christendom apart, right? Because you had the massive, what altercations between the Protestants and the Catholics, and
you had something
that was a direct consequence of the printing press.
Something very freeing about that. All of a sudden, you can read God's word in the vernacular, which the church was protecting its power by preventing that.
Well, it also meant eventually that the entire world was made literate. It was a major league transformation.
So maybe, to be positive, maybe this Tower of Babel at the moment that we're building, maybe this period we're in will have a settling down period in its wake.
Well,
I mean, ultimately,
it depends on how we conduct ourselves. Like if you guys move to Phoenix and you start your entertainment consortium and you start making comedy that can actually be viewed by people and that's genuinely funny and free, then you're going to tilt the world a little farther away from the all-seeing eye of Sauron and the Tower of Babel and towards something approximating freedom.
Now we just need to turn that into a logo.
Yeah, that's right. If you can think of anything, but that's
you can
maybe
use the Tower of Babel, although the EEC has already managed that. Right.
But there's something about tilting the world in that direction. I do love that. It's not new. I mean, it's not. It's what you're identifying really is the enduring appeal of authoritarianism throughout human history, which will manifest itself in one way or another. And it just so happens that at the moment it's manifesting itself in this way.
Yeah.
And it seems to me that
fast
and quicker than ever before.
Yeah, that's right.
So it's been catalyzed in this strange way. But it feels to me as though the struggle in of itself between liberty and authority is one thing, but the struggle to recognize the threat of authority, of authoritarianism, seems to be another battle you have to have. In other words,
because the attack doesn't come from the position you expect, not if it's going to be effective.
This is a point I have been trying to make to Richard Dawkins, which he cannot hear. The ancients had no idea about genes. They couldn't, nor would it have helped them to. They don't understand that they are suffering from a kind of delusion, which is about the significance of self. Self is a very temporary instantiation of lineage. Evolution does not care about the self because the self is disposable. The lineage either continues or fails to continue, and evolutionary success is not how much you reproduce. It's how far into the future your lineage is capable of making. So
that's the story of Abraham, by the way.
You're telling me.
Okay.
So here's my point. Is heaven real? Yes and no. We have no evidence that there's a place. On the other hand, if you live so as to get into heaven, what it will do, for reasons that a sociologist, at least a good sociologist, would easily recognize, is it will place your kin and your descendants in an excellent position relative to each other to get into the future. Do you live on after death? Yes, you do. You live on in lineage. Right? It's not the individual, so it's a modification of the reality. But the point is, how much difference is there between the idea of living on after you die in the way that any biologist would recognize that a successful individual did, and living on after you die in some storybook form that's much easier to convey to a child or to an uninitiated person, right? My point is that life after death does exist, and every biologist agrees. They just don't put it in those terms. So the question is, why are we allowed to draw where in that continuum from the fully descriptive and material to the fully metaphorical are we allowed to draw the line and say, here is where we have stopped being analytical? If it's a continuum, it is a continuum. And the place where I fault my colleagues the most is that they do not understand, they do not acknowledge the degree to which even the models that we have inside of biology are largely metaphorical, not because we won't ultimately know how biology works, but because we don't know yet. And, you know, even just to look back into the recent history of biology, you can see that it is a question of replacing approximate stories, metaphorical stories, with literal stories. And that doesn't break down when we get out towards what is obviously an adaptive tendency of human beings to believe in a spirit realm.
Why do people go to church? Right? Because that's what's going on.
And why should they?
Right.
Because that's a discussion. So Jonathan took me to an Orthodox ceremony in Seattle, and like I wasn't into it. I found it grated on me.
You're like a 10-year-old boy that we're telling to stop moving.
Yeah, that's right. So that was my Freudian fixations. Like, yeah, you're 10.
Stop wiggling.
Yeah, stop wiggling. Yeah, no kidding. No kidding. But, you know, there's been a lot of water under the bridge since then, man. And I went to an Orthodox mass here a couple of weeks ago, and I found it and a Catholic one a week before that. I was down at Franciscan University, and I found it unbelievably soothing, which was very much unlike the reactions I've had before. And that was partly, well, for complicated reasons, because I actually find any place that isn't a bloody nightmarish catastrophe soothing now. And so I mean that, man. But there was more to it than that, too. It was because I also did develop, and partly as a consequence of our discussions, a deeper appreciation for what was happening in the ritual itself, and also more tolerance for whatever inadequacies I might perceive, you know. And partly that's also a realization, you know, lots of modern people say, well, I don't go to church because I don't believe that. It's like, well, A, who cares what you believe? Like, who the hell are you anyways? Like, and why do you even care what you believe? And how's that working for you, this belief set that you theoretically have? And so how sophisticated is that? Like, are you Plato or what? It's like, well, here's the church and here's me and I'm right. It's like, well, no, you're not. And first, and second, you don't even want to be, because that's a great place to be. Like, pinnacle of brilliant wisdom. It's completely solipsistic. No tradition for me, thank you very much. You know, I've got it all right in my head. And even if you are right that the bloody institution is chaotic and decadent in some fundamental sense, it's like, well, good, there's something for you to do, like there always has been throughout the entire history of mankind, because that's Osiris, right? The once great king who's fallen into disrepair. It's like, well, if the church is broken and you're the genius to see it, why don't you go fix it? Well, then you might say, well, we'll just abandon it. It's like, okay, well, fine. You're going to get rid of that, eh? You're going to get rid of marriage. You're going to get rid of funerals. You're going to get rid of Christmas. You're going to get rid of any sense of sacred time. You're going to dispense with the whole history of what Judeo-Christian thought. You're going to dispense with the idea of the sacred nature of the individual. Like, how far are you willing to go with this? And believe me, that question is right in front of you, because there's a wave of radicals who are asking you at every moment, what makes you so sure that there's a difference between a man and a woman? Like, no, there isn't. Or yes, there is when we want there to be, and no, there isn't when we don't want there to be. You saw that with the Supreme Court appointment. It's like, we have to have a woman, but there's no such thing as a woman. It's like, and so, yeah, you Frenchmen, you know, you've abandoned your Catholicism. You think the Catholics, they were crazy. It's like, you ain't seen nothing yet. And so I believe, and Jung kind of convinced me of that. He more or less posited, and you could say the same thing about Orthodox. He said, Catholic is as sane as people ever get. And that's partly because we have to have one foot in the dream and the mystery. We have to. You know, when I heard Douglas Murray speak recently about this, that was very interesting because Murray is an atheist, essentially, and he has a variety of reasons for that. But he has swung around hard recently, and he said, when he was talking to Dave Rubin, he said, I don't believe that either conservatism or classic liberalism can survive in the absence of the religious surround, which was really something for him to admit. And it's like taken him like 5 years of thinking to come to that conclusion. But then he said something even more remarkable, I thought. And he said, and it's actually the mysterious part of it that has to be retained. The virgin birth, the resurrection, the crucifixion, all of that crazy mythology, let's say, because otherwise it just degenerates into another form of cheap social justice. And like, don't we have enough of that? And I think that's, now I don't know what to make of that because, well, and that's why we have discussion continually about the, what would you say? Well, the transcendent, I suppose, the miraculous, the transcendent, the idea of the resurrection, for example, and all of that. It's like, well, what do you do with that? And the answer is, we don't know, but we don't throw it out without having some sense of what's going to come in to replace it. And we're seeing that now. You know, look at us. We're so confused. No bloody wonder the Russians are at war with us. It's like, we're not having anything to do with those people. They simultaneously proclaim that a woman is absolutely necessary for the highest position in the land, or one of them, and that the same person says, well, I don't even know what a woman is. It's like, well, are those people insane? It's like, clearly, that's just way too far, right? Like, when I talk to my Democrat friends, I say, look, you can have one of those. You know, there's either no distinction between a man and a woman, or it's important that a woman's on the Supreme Court. But there's no bloody way I'm giving you both. So, because I don't even know how to do that. I have no idea how to do that. Like, what am I supposed to do? Celebrate womanhood and simultaneously celebrate the fact that the differences between men and women are so trivial that they're irrelevant and they can be changed at whim. That is insane. It violates the law of non-contradiction. And so there's no, that's, you think religious people are crazy.
My particular work has uncovered aspects of religiosity that runs counter to standard theories of religion. Most scholars of religion subscribe to the theory that the function of religion is to modulate anxiety levels, or it's to stave off the fear of death. In other words, religion as a security blanket. But that's a side effect of what I think religion is really doing. The real thing that religion is doing is that it's looking for ways to disrupt current models of the self in its relation to the world. So the religious mind is constantly producing these other worlds. And when religion does that, it very interestingly calls into question the fundamental aspects of our world. I think if we want to understand human nature, we have to understand religion. My name is Patrick McNamara, and I'm an experimental neuroscientist, and I have a special interest in studying relationships of brain activity to religious consciousness. Our identities are constantly under construction. Religions have provided the traditional tools to edit those self-models, to update them, to shape them, to create them. Therefore, self and religion are bound up together because there's no way for the brain to function optimally, even normally, without those self-models. So we have to understand that the brain is a prediction machine. It's a desiring machine. It's looking to build up models of what we can expect to occur next in the world. What the religious mind is doing is looking for evidence out in the world to disconfirm current models of the world. in particular, current self models of the world, the individual in his or her world. So there's no way that we're going to thrive or flourish in the world unless we get very good at updating our self models. One of the most interesting things about religious experience and religious cognition is it constantly promotes imaginative simulation of other possible worlds. A good prediction machine is constantly spinning out scenarios of what might be, what could possibly be. Because when we disconfirm those current self models, we then know that our current models are not adequate. And so we got to update them. My point of view is that religious experiences reflects a neurotechnology to update the current sense of self. It appears to be what nature has evolved for us to make self-transformation as easy as possible. And when you dig into that process, what you find is a very interesting set of cognitive processing routines, what's called a decentering. The decentering process is composed of 4 cognitive steps. The first one is the decentering itself, where the executive sense of self is taken offline. That self that makes decisions, that forms intentions, that forms goals, wants to accomplish things in the world, gets decentered, gets down-regulated. The second step is the individual undergoes what we call a liminal experience. So they're no longer feeling in control, and so their sense of self just drifts, and they're immersed in a sea of images, affects, emotions. They experience these very intense emotional experiences that are labeled spiritual. And then the brain does a search in an updating process, a search for a stronger, better, more adequate self model. And then the last step in the decentering process is when that self model is then basically activated, and a new sense of self emerges from the decentering process. And that's one of the main accomplishments of religiosity when it's working well. It gives the individual a set of tools to do that updating of the sense of self, so that you have an enriched sense of self and the individual is able to live a more flourishing and thriving life. These processes that were normally held as sacred within all the world's religious traditions are now entering the secular arenas, and because they're so powerful, they're dangerous. In the wrong hands, it can create fanatics, people who are immune to updating their beliefs. And if you question those beliefs, you get violent reactions. The decentering process is such a powerful neurotechnology. It makes us incredibly vulnerable when we trigger it. So it needs to be held in a ritual process that will take it safely from step 1 right through the liminal process, the scary liminal process, through the editing, updating process, and then finally the reactivation of an enriched sense of self. Every one of those steps, if they go off the rails, it creates huge psychological and other problems. So as we understand this decentering process, a natural next question to ask is, how can we use that kind of knowledge to help people or to find better ways to live in the world? With regard to people who consider themselves religious, one of the things that they might do is rediscover their own traditions. Things like ascetical practices, ritual practices, scripture, meditation, study. Some of the key ingredients of those tools are this decentering process. So religious believers can take that information and rediscover the riches of their own tradition in terms of those tools. Non-religious people, they can take this information regarding the neurotechnology of self-transformation and find or create tools that promote the decentering process, because it ain't easy. You know, if you try to do it consciously, it's not that easy. What makes me really excited about the field is that it is uncovering some fundamental aspects of human nature, human experience. It's interesting. It's simultaneously enhancing of our understanding of this realm of human experience, but also deepening the mystery.
Greetings from Port Townsend, Washington. We moved here 10 years ago from San Jose, and we're doing well. Thanks for inviting us to greet you. It's been great for us to revisit all the memories of our trips to Transylvania. We first became aware of the Unitarians in Transylvania when Zizi Gellert visited the San Jose church and played her violin while dressed in her native costume. Joseph Kazany visited also, and since he was looking for a place to stay for a week, we offered our home. After a couple of days, Joseph was complaining of headaches. We soon realized that since Pat drinks only decaf coffee, Joseph was suffering from caffeine withdrawal without even knowing what that was. Poor Joseph. But he was a good sport, and after a couple of cups of coffee, he was fine.
So our first trip to Transylvania was in 1992 in the summer. We flew from San Jose to Vienna and then took the train, the Orient Express, to Székesfehérvár, and then by car to Homrod Szent Martin, where we were guests of Joseph and Maria Kazany in their home. We took them Zizi's translation of Spirit of Life, Isten Lelke, which we sang in the church there on Sunday, July 29th. In 1996, we returned, first by going to England to visit a friend, and then we flew to Budapest, where Joseph was the minister now of the Second Unitarian Church. We then drove with Danish Farkas to Homrod Szent Martin with Bob and Jenny Redfern, 1 year after Bela Crisboy became the minister there. We stayed in the newly opened Youth Conference Center. And then our third trip was in 1999. We went to Budapest and then to Transylvania with Joseph guiding us. Doug captures the morning sounds of Homrod Szent Martin in his tape recorder. Birds calling, cow herd horn sounding, passing horses, cars, tractors, into church bells.
We have so many great memories of those trips. Homrod Szent Martin was so different from San Jose or any other place that we had ever visited. It was more like the fairy tales that we learned as children, where the storks nested on the chimney tops and the cows went out to pasture each morning. In Switzerland, we saw the recreation of the village. In Transylvania, we saw the real thing. And we met real people who went out of their way to be friendly. We learned so much about how their lives had changed due to the fall of the communist government. They went back to horses and field work by hand. It must have been very difficult. And of course, there was the satellite dish next to the stork's nest on the roof. We saw a house being built. The stones were mortared together with cement made from burned limestone, just like the Romans did. I had only read about that, but there it was. We loved the village church with the folk art paintings, the raised pulpit, the pump organ, and the bell. Pat got to play the organ a little bit, and I wanted to see the bell not realizing that it was a climb. Olivia quickly volunteered to help me, and we climbed up the inside of the bell tower. It was great. One night we ate dinner at Dambi Jula and Tundi's home. He left the table briefly to let in the cow, who was knocking on the gate. That was something we had not experienced before. Our visits so enriched our lives. We are so thankful that we had the opportunity, and we're so thankful for all the people who helped us along the way.
Do you pray to God?
God in what sense?
In what sense do you see God? Is there a God?
There is, let's say, the theistic religions, their fundamental sort of faith is creator, God, as a creator. Then non-theistic religion, that's, you see, one ancient Indian religion, the Sanskrit word, the Sankhya philosophy, and then Jain philosophy, then Buddhist philosophy. These three, no concept of God, creator. Of course, Buddha, as a Buddhist, we consider Buddha as a teacher.
Teacher, not a God.
Not God, not creator. So, some kind of the concept of self-creation there. The Buddha stated, you are your own master.